He refused to pay for his daughter's surgery to buy a Ferrari. 10 years later, he woke up from a coma and saw her face. Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. Before we witness the fall of a man who thought he was a god, take a deep breath with me. How is your heart today? I know the weight of the world can feel heavy, like gravity is pulling a little harder on your shoulders than it should. But you are here, you are safe, and you are loved. May peace find you wherever you are listening from tonight. I ask that a blanket of calm covers every soul in our family. If there is anxiety in your chest, may it be replaced with clarity. If there is sorrow in your spirit, may it be replaced with hope. May you find the strength to weather your winters, knowing that no night is too dark for the dawn to eventually break. And family, I have a small confession to make, something that sits heavy on my own heart. When I first started this channel, when I first sat down to share these stories with you, my own mother looked at me with sad eyes. She told me, "Don't get your hopes up. You won't even reach 1,000 people. No one wants to listen." It hurt, deep down. But looking at you now, I know she was wrong. But I need your help to prove that love is louder than doubt. If you believe in what we are building here, if you believe in this family, please subscribe. It is the one free thing you can do that means the world to me, and it tells the doubts that they have no place in our home. Let's begin with love always. The showroom smelled of aggressive wealth, a potent mixture of cured Italian leather, tire rubber, and the metallic tang of money that had nowhere else to go. The lighting in the private viewing bay was surgically precise, calibrated to make the Rosso Corsa paint of the Ferrari Monza SP1 look less like a color and more like spilled blood under the midday sun. Julian Vance stood before the machine with his hands deep in the pockets of his bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't just look at the car, he consumed it. It was a single-seater, a selfish, beautiful thing designed for one purpose: to tell the world that the driver needed no one else. The dealer, a man named Reynolds who wore a smile that cost more than most people's education, hovered just out of arm's reach, terrified of breaking Julian's concentration. "It is one of only 499 in existence, Mr. Vance," Reynolds whispered, as if they were in a cathedral. The allocation list was difficult, but for a man of your stature, exceptions were made. Julian ran a finger along the curve of the fender. It was cold, smooth, and perfect. "Exceptions are for people who ask," Julian said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't ask, Reynolds. I acquire." His phone buzzed against his chest, a harsh, vibrating intrusion into his moment of worship. Julian pulled it out, frowning at the screen. The name, Isabella, flashed urgently. His wife. Or, as he had started thinking of her lately, his primary liability. He declined the call. He turned back to the car. "The wire transfer is ready. 2.8 million. The phone buzzed again. And again. The persistence was grating, like a mosquito in a pristine room. With a sigh that sucked the air out of the space, Julian answered. "This had better be an emergency, Isabella," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "I am in the middle of an acquisition." "She can't feel her legs, Julian." Isabella's voice was thin, brittle, cracking under the weight of terror. "Sienna collapsed an hour ago. The specialist is here. He says the curvature has crushed the nerve root. If we don't operate within 48 hours, the paralysis will be permanent." "Permanent, Julian." Julian looked at the Ferrari. He looked at the carbon fiber splitter that cost more than his childhood home. He did the math in his head, the cold, brutal calculus that had made him a titan of industry. "We discussed this," Julian said, turning his back to Reynolds for privacy, though he didn't truly care who heard. "The surgery is experimental. The success rate is 60%. And the cost is $250,000, Isabella. That is throwing good money after bad. She is your daughter." Isabella screamed. The sound was distorted, tinny through the speaker. "She is 10 years old. She is in agony. You have the money. I know you have it. You're buying a car today, aren't you? I saw the brochure on your desk. You're choosing a toy over your child's spine." Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's not a toy. It's a legacy asset. It appreciates. It holds value." He glanced at the car, gleaming under the lights. "Sienna was born weak. That is a genetic tragedy, yes, but I will not liquidate liquid capital for a gamble. If she is weak, that is nature taking its course. I won't waste my legacy on a broken investment." "You monster," Isabella whispered. "If you do this, if you let her fall, Don't bother coming home. There won't be a home. Don't threaten me with poverty, Isabella. I own the roof over your head." He ended the call. He didn't just hang up. He pressed the red button with a sense of finality, severing the connection to the weeping woman and the broken child. He felt a moment of irritation, a fleck of dust on his lapel, but he brushed it off. He turned to Reynolds, who was pretending to study a specification sheet. "The papers," Julian commanded. "Bring them." 10 minutes later, the ink was drying on the contract. The transfer was complete. The keys, heavy, substantial, significant, were in his palm. Julian slid into the driver's seat. It was a tight fit, hugging his ribs, molding to him like a second skin. He pressed the ignition, and the V12 engine roared to life, a sound so violent and beautiful it vibrated in his teeth. "Drive it in good health, Mr. Vance," Reynolds called out, opening the bay doors to the late afternoon sun. Julian didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge the little man. He shifted into gear and punched the throttle. The car surged forward, leaving the showroom and merging onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The wind tore at his hair. The engine screamed a symphony of mechanical perfection. This was power. This was what mattered. Not the whining of a wife, not the weakness of a child, but this absolute control over a machine that obeyed his every whim. He pushed the speedometer higher. 80, 100, 120. The world blurred into streaks of blue ocean and gray asphalt. He felt immortal. He felt like a god in a chariot of fire. He thought about Isabella's threat and laughed, the sound whipped away by the wind. They needed him. They would always need him. He held the purse strings of their existence. Little did he know, the sun dipping below the horizon was the last one he would see for a decade. He took the curve at Devil's Slide too fast. It wasn't the car's fault. The machine was perfect. It was the oil slick on the asphalt, invisible and unforgiving. The tires lost grip. The rear end snapped out. Julian corrected, but physics is a cruel mistress who cares nothing for bank accounts. The Ferrari spun, hitting the guardrail with the sound of tearing metal, a shriek that sounded terrifyingly like a human scream. The carbon fiber shattered. The car launched over the edge, tumbling into the void towards the rocks below. The sky spun. Blue, gray, red, black. Then, there was only the crushing silence of the end. And Julian Vance, the man who chose a machine over his own blood, fell into a darkness so deep that not even his millions could buy a way out. The first thing that returned was not pain, but the color white. It was an aggressive, blinding white that seared through his eyelids before he even opened them. Julian tried to lift his hand to shield his face, but his arm felt like it belonged to someone else. A heavy, leaden thing that refused to obey the commands of his brain. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling was a grid of sterile tiles, punctuated by a fluorescent light that hummed with the irritating frequency of a dying insect. The smell hit him next, antiseptic, floor wax, and the stale, recycled air of a place where people came to wait for death. This was a hospital. He knew that much. Memories fragmented and collided in his mind. The Rosso Corsa paint, the leather steering wheel, the curve at Devil's Slide, the scream of metal. My car, he thought, a desperate, greedy impulse rising through the fog of sedation. Is the car salvageable? He tried to speak, to demand a status report, but his throat was a desert. His tongue felt swollen, filling his mouth like a dry sponge. A tube ran into his nose, another into his arm. Machines beeped in a rhythmic, indifferent cadence beside him, measuring the persistence of a life he wasn't sure he still owned. Julian scanned the room, expecting the plush amenities of a VIP suite at Cedars-Sinai or perhaps a private clinic in Switzerland. He expected mahogany paneling, a view of the skyline, perhaps a dedicated nurse waiting for his command. Instead, he saw peeling paint in the corner near the air vent. He saw a linoleum floor scuffed by years of heavy traffic. He saw a window that looked out not onto a city, but onto a brick wall. Something was wrong. This wasn't where men of his stature recovered. This was a holding cell for the irrelevant. He tried to sit up, but his muscles were atrophied, wasted away to nothing but string and bone. A low groan escaped his lips, a pathetic, rusty sound that embarrassed him instantly. Where's Isabella? He wondered. Where's my legal team? Where's Reynolds? Someone needs to explain why I am in this hovel. He lay there for what felt like hours, trapped in the prison of his own body, staring at the dust motes dancing in the harsh light. He assumed it had been a day, perhaps two, since the crash. He would sue the city for the road conditions. He would sue Ferrari for the traction control failure. He would sue this hospital for the peeling paint. He was Julian Vance, and he would monetize this suffering. Little did he know, the world outside that window had moved on without him for 3,650 days. A shadow fell across the bed. It wasn't the soft, deferential approach of a private nurse. It was a stillness, a presence that felt less like a caregiver and more like a judge. Julian strained his eyes toward the corner of the room. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. A doctor, dressed in dark blue scrubs, arms crossed over their chest. They weren't checking the monitors. They weren't adjusting his four. They were just watching him with a terrifying intensity. Julian tried to make a sound, to demand water, to demand respect. The figure stepped forward, and the light caught the reflection of wire-rimmed glasses, but the lower half of their face was obscured by a surgical mask. The doctor didn't speak. They just stood at the foot of the bed, looking down at him not with pity, but with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. And for the first time in his life, Julian Vance felt small. The examination was brutal in its efficiency. The doctor, whose name tag was flipped backward, moved with a speed that bordered on aggression. Cold hands and latex gloves prodded Julian's ribs, lifted his eyelids, and tested the reflexes of his wasted legs. There was no "this might hurt a little," no gentle bedside manner. Just the mechanical assessment of damage. Julian wanted to scream. He wanted to tell this person that he was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that he could buy this hospital and turn it into a parking lot by noon. But his vocal cords were still paralyzed by disuse, locking his rage inside his throat. Pupils responsive, the doctor muttered, their voice muffled by the mask. It was a woman's voice, alto, steady, devoid of warmth. Muscle atrophy consistent with long-term decubitus. We'll need to increase the protein intake, though it's likely a waste of resources. Waste of resources? Julian's mind reeled. He was the resource. He was the generator of wealth. How dare she speak of him as if he were a burden? She moved to the side of the bed and adjusted the foredrip. Her eyes, visible above the mask, were a startling shade of amber. They locked onto his, and Julian felt a jolt of recognition that he couldn't quite place. He had seen those eyes before, perhaps on a magazine cover, perhaps across a boardroom table. They held an intelligence that unsettled him. "You're confused," she stated, not asking. "You're wondering why the sheets are rough. You're wondering why there are no flowers on the bedside table. You're wondering why you can't feel your toes." She picked up a metal chart from the end of the bed and flipped it open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You have a grade 3 bedsore on your sacrum. Your bone density has decreased by 40%. Your empire," she paused, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine blade, "is currently contained within the 4 walls of this room." Julian tried to glare, to summon the look that had made junior executives weep in quarterly reviews. But without his suit, without his voice, without his height, he was just a skeleton in a gown. She leaned in close, dangerously close. He could smell soap, unscented, utilitarian soap. Not the Chanel perfume Isabella used to wear. "You think you've been asleep for a weekend, Julian," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name, and she stripped it of all titles. "No, mister, no, sir. Just the raw identifier. You think you're going to call your broker and fix this?" She pulled a penlight from her pocket and shined it in his left eye, blinding him momentarily. He flinched, turning his head away. "Pain response is intact," she noted, clicking the light off. "Good. You'll need that." She turned to leave, her heavy boots squeaking on the linoleum. Julian thrashed his hand against the rail, a desperate, clumsy movement to stop her. He needed answers. He needed to know why he was being treated like a pauper. She stopped at the door, her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "Get some rest, patient 409, she said. "You have a lot of catching up to do. The world isn't the way you left it. And neither are you." She glanced back over her shoulder, and for a second, the mask slipped slightly as she adjusted it. He saw the edge of a scar on her jawline. Or maybe it was just a shadow. "Welcome back to the bottom, Julian." It took 3 days for the first word to claw its way out of his throat. "Water." It came out as a croak, a pathetic rasp that sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. The nurse, a large man with tired eyes and a stain on his scrubbed top, didn't even look up from the monitor he was wiping down. "Sip," the nurse said, holding a plastic cup with a straw to Julian's lips. "Don't choke. I don't want to fill out the paperwork." Julian drank greedily, the lukewarm water feeling like nectar. As the moisture coated his throat, his brain fired rapidly, assembling the demands he had been storing up. "Phone," Julian rasped. "I need my phone." The nurse laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Phone? Buddy, the only thing you have in your personal effects bag is a broken watch and a wallet with expired credit cards." "Call Reynolds," Julian demanded, his voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Ferrari dealership." "Call Isabella, my wife." The nurse stopped wiping the monitor. He looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Look, Mr. Vance, I've been on this shift for 12 hours. I don't have time for fairy tales." "It's not a fairy tale," Julian wheezed, anger flushing his pale cheeks. "I am Julian Vance, venture capital. Call my wife." The nurse sighed, put down his rag, and walked over to the computer terminal mounted on the wall. He tapped a few keys, the keyboard clacking loudly. "Vance, Julian," the nurse muttered, reading the screen. "Admitted October 14th, 2014. Status, long-term care. Indigent ward." "Indigent?" Julian choked on the word. "I am a millionaire." "Computer says you're a ward of the state, basically," the nurse said, shrugging. "And as for contacts," he scrolled down. "Emergency contact listed, none." "That's a lie," Julian spat, trying to push himself up on his elbows and failing. "Isabella Vance." "Check again." "No Isabella," the nurse said, closing the window. "There was a note here from social services from, wow, 7 years ago. Says next of kin deceased." "Sorry, pal." The room spun. "Deceased? Isabella?" "No. She was young. She was vibrant. She was annoying, yes, but she was alive. She had been screaming at him on the phone just an hour ago." "My daughter," Julian whispered, the memory of the surgery request surfacing through the shock. "Sienna. Find Sienna." "No children listed," the nurse said, turning to leave. "Just you. All alone in the big bad world." "Wait," Julian screamed, the sound tearing at his raw throat. "I have money. I can pay you. Get me a lawyer." The nurse stopped at the door. He looked back at the withered man in the bed, the man who still thought he commanded armies of wealth. "You don't get it, do you?" the nurse said softly. "You've been here for a decade. In the beginning, there were news crews. Then lawyers. Then creditors. Then silence." He flipped the light switch, plunging the room into semi-darkness. "You haven't had a single visitor in 8 years, Mr. Vance. Not one. You're not a millionaire anymore. You're just the guy in bed for who needs his diaper changed." The door clicked shut. Julian lay in the dark, the hum of the machines the only sound in the universe. He waited for the punchline. He waited for the nightmare to end. But the darkness persisted, heavy and suffocating. And for the first time, he realized that the silence wasn't peace. It was exile. Morning brought no sunlight, only the aggressive hum of the floor buffer in the hallway and the clattering of breakfast carts that smelled of lukewarm oatmeal and despair. Julian Vance lay awake, his mind racing with the manic energy of a man who believes he has simply overslept. He began to do the math. It was a comforting ritual, the only prayer he had ever known. If he had been out for 10 years, as the nurse claimed, a lie, surely, but he would entertain the hypothesis. Then his assets had been sitting in trust. His portfolio was aggressive. Real estate in San Francisco, tech stocks in the nascent stages of explosion, the offshore accounts in the Caymans. Compound interest, he whispered, his voice gaining a shred of its former gravel. The eighth wonder of the world. If the principal was $200 million and he assumed a conservative 7% annual return, he wasn't just rich. He was a billionaire. The realization made his heart hammer against his brittle ribs. They were treating a billionaire like a vagrant. The lawsuit would be historic. He would buy this hospital just to fire that nurse. A young orderly entered, carrying a tray of beige slop. Julian ignored the food. "The television," Julian commanded, pointing a shaking finger at the box mounted on the wall. "Turn it on." "Bloomberg. CNBC. Something with a ticker." The orderly shrugged, pulled a remote from his pocket, and clicked the power button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a local news channel. A weatherman was gesturing at a map of a drought-stricken California. Julian squinted. The picture was clear, but his brain refused to process the information at the bottom of the screen. He blinked, trying to clear the fog. October 17th, 2024. The numbers sat there, unassuming and catastrophic. 2024. The math in his head screeched to a halt. It wasn't a weekend. It wasn't a month. It was a decade. A lost decade. No, he whispered. That's a rerun. But then the news anchor shifted to a story about a tech merger. Companies Julian didn't recognize, run by CEOs who were children when he was on the cover of Forbes. They were talking about AI, about neural links, about a world that sounded like science fiction. He thought of his accounts, his passwords, his signature authority, who had been managing the empire for 10 years. Isabella was allegedly dead. Sienna was irrelevant. Had the state taken it? Had Reynolds embezzled it? My money, Julian gasped, clutching the thin blanket. Where is my money? The orderly paused at the door, looking back with mild amusement. Buddy, if you had money, you wouldn't be eating grits in Ward C. You're in the state-subsidized wing. This is where they put the people who ran out of road. Julian stared at the date on the screen. 2024. He had bought a Ferrari in 2014. He had traded a future for a machine. And now, the machine was gone. The future was here, and he was empty. Little did he know, the person managing his accounts wasn't a banker. It was the woman standing in the hallway, reviewing his chart with a red pen, deciding exactly how much pain he could endure today. The torture began at 2 p.m. They called it physical therapy, a euphemism for the systematic dismantling of a man's dignity. Two large therapists hoisted Julian out of the bed like a sack of wet laundry. His legs, once strong enough to ski the Alps, dangled uselessly, thin as broomsticks. They strapped him into a standing frame, a cage of metal and Velcro designed to force his body upright. Push, the therapist instructed. Feel the floor. Engage your quads. I am engaging. Julian snarled, sweat stinging his eyes. This equipment is defective. It wasn't. He was. The connection between his brain and his legs was a fuzzy static. He trembled, his entire body shaking with the effort of simply existing against gravity. Pain shot up his spine, a white-hot reminder of the crash, of the crushed vertebrae that had been hastily fused all those years ago. He lasted 45 seconds before he collapsed into the straps, gasping for air, drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. Pathetic, he whispered to himself. It is, a voice agreed from the doorway. Dr. Kale walked in. She wasn't wearing a white coat today, just the severe blue scrubs that made her look like a mechanic of the human body. She held a clipboard in one hand and a large hand mirror in the other. She dismissed the therapists with a nod. They unstrapped Julian and lowered him back into the wheelchair, leaving him slumped and panting. Dr. Kale walked over to him. She didn't check his pulse. She didn't offer water. She simply held up the mirror. Look, she ordered. I don't want to. Julian spat, turning his head away. Look at the investment, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming hard and dangerously quiet. You always talked about ROI, Julian. Return on investment. Look at the return. She forced the mirror into his line of sight. Julian gasped. The face staring back at him was a stranger. The thick, dark hair was gone, replaced by wisps of gray. His skin was papery and translucent, draped over sharp cheekbones like wet tissue. His eyes, once predatory and sharp, were sunken into dark hollows. His teeth looked yellow. He wasn't the titan of industry. He was a withered old man. A husk. You look at me and you see a servant, Dr. Kale said, lowering the mirror but keeping her eyes pinned to his. You see a generic doctor in a generic hospital. But when I look at you, I don't see a billionaire. I see a ledger that is deep in the red. I will sue you, Julian whispered, tears of humiliation pricking his eyes. I will hire the best lawyers. With what? She interrupted. You can't even lift a 1-pound weight. You can't even lift your own head for more than a minute. You are entirely dependent on the charity of strangers. She leaned in, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. And strangers aren't very charitable these days. She turned and walked out, leaving the mirror on his lap. Julian stared at his reflection, at the wreckage of a man who had thought he was invincible. He waited for the anger to return, but it didn't. Only fear remained. Night in the ward was never silent. It was a chorus of suffering, coughing, groaning, the rhythmic hiss of oxygen tanks. But tonight, the noise faded into the background as Julian's mind drifted back to the last time he had felt truly powerful. He was back in the penthouse. The air conditioner was humming. The view of the city was a carpet of diamonds. Isabella was standing by the fireplace, holding a weeping child. Sienna. She was 10. She was small for her age, her spine twisting in a way that made her walk with a limp. She was crying, a high, thin sound that Julian found irritating. "Make her stop," Julian had said, swirling his scotch. "It's weakness, Isabella. Coddling her only makes it worse." "She hurts, Julian," Isabella had pleaded. "She needs the brace. She needs the surgery." "The surgery is 200 grand, Julian had countered, checking his watch. "The Ferrari allocation is today. Do you know what the appreciation on a Monza is? 500% in 3 years. Sienna's surgery has a 0% financial return. She's your daughter. She is a bad investment." The memory was so vivid he could smell the scotch. He could feel the cold logic settling in his gut, the absolute certainty that he was right. Money was finite. Legacy was forever. A car was a monument. A sick child was a drain. He snapped back to the present. The hospital room was dark. His back was throbbing, a dull ache that radiated down his dead legs. Someone was in the room. Dr. Kale was standing by the monitors, her face illuminated by the green glow of the heart rate trace. She was checking the fluid levels in his forebag. She thought he was asleep. She was humming. It was a soft, melodic tune, barely a whisper. A lullaby. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." No, not that. It was something older. An Italian folk song Isabella used to sing. "Dormi, dormi, bel bambino." Julian froze. His heart rate monitor picked up the spike. Beep, 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 beep. Dr. Kale stopped humming instantly. She looked at the monitor, then at him. Her eyes were unreadable in the dark. "Pain?" she asked. "That song," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "My wife, she sang that." Dr. Kale didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply checked the drip rate, her fingers deft and steady. "It's a common song," she said, her voice stripping the room of any magic. "Go to sleep, Julian. Your heart is working too hard." She turned to leave, but she paused at the threshold. For a second, just a second, the cold professional mask slipped. She looked at him with an expression that terrified him more than hatred. It was pity. "Some investments," she said softly, "have a very long maturity date." She walked out. Julian lay in the dark, the echo of the lullaby looping in his head. It was impossible. Isabella was dead. Sienna was gone. He was alone. But as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost of his daughter was not haunting the past, but standing at the foot of his bed, holding a clipboard and a pen. The visitor arrived on a Tuesday, carrying a briefcase that looked as tired as his face. Julian had spent the morning mentally rehearsing his demands. He was prepared to fire his entire legal team for negligence. He was prepared to authorize a scorched earth lawsuit against the hospital. He sat up in bed, propped by pillows, trying to project the aura of a CEO despite the humiliating hospital gown. But when the door opened, it wasn't the shark-like senior partners of Sterling and Vance who walked in. It was Gerald, a junior associate from the tax department, or at least, he had been a junior associate 10 years ago. Now, Gerald was balding. His suit was off the rack, and he smelled of stale coffee and resignation. "Mr. Vance," Gerald said, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed. He didn't offer a hand. I didn't believe it when they called. We thought you were a vegetable. Permanent vegetative state." "I am very much awake, Gerald," Julian rasped, his voice gaining an edge. "Where are the partners? Where's the board? Why did they send you?" Gerald sighed, pulling a plastic chair over and sitting heavily. He opened his briefcase. It wasn't filled with legal briefs. It contained a single, thin manila folder. "The partners are gone, Julian. The firm dissolved in 2017. The board voted you out in absentia 2 weeks after the crash. Morals clause. Reckless endangerment." "They can't do that," Julian snarled. "I own the controlling interest." "You owned," Gerald corrected gently. He slid a paper across the bedsheet. "This is a summary of liquidation assets, dated November 2015. Julian snatched the paper with a trembling hand. The numbers were a blur of red ink. "Your health insurance had a cap, Julian. A lifetime max of $2 million. You burned through that in the first 18 months. The ICU bills alone were astronomical. Gerald rubbed his eyes. We had to liquidate. The penthouse, the portfolio, the offshore accounts. Everything went to paying the hospital and the creditors. The car, Julian whispered. The Ferrari. It was insured for $3 million. Gerald shook his head, a look of pity on his face that made Julian's stomach turn. You drove it off the lot before the binder was processed. You hadn't signed the final insurance addendum. The car was a total loss. Uninsured. We sold the scrap metal for $400. $400. $2.8 million reduced to a pile of junk worth less than a suit jacket. So I am broke, Julian said, the words tasting like ash. That's what you're telling me. I am destitute. Technically, you're in debt, Gerald said, standing up. About $4 million in outstanding medical liens. I'm just here as a courtesy, Julian. No one else wanted to come. Everyone else moved on. Gerald snapped his briefcase shut. I have to go. My meter is running, and I know you can't pay it. He walked to the door. Wait, Julian called out, a sudden realization striking him like a physical blow. If I have no money, if the insurance ran out 8 years ago, who is paying for this room? He gestured to the monitors, the IVs, the specialized air mattress. This is a private room in a specialized neurological wing. This costs $10,000 a day. Who is signing the checks? Gerald paused. He looked back, confused. I assumed it was the state. Or maybe a charity. The state puts people in hallways. Julian shouted. Someone is paying for this. Who? Gerald shrugged. I don't know, Julian. But whoever they are, they've spent a fortune keeping you alive. You should probably thank them. The door closed. Julian sat in the silence, the ledger of his life burning a hole in his lap. He wasn't just broke, he was a kept man. Someone was investing millions in a coma patient. And in Julian's world, nobody invested without expecting a return. Obsession was a familiar fuel for Julian Vance. It had built his empire, and now it fueled his recovery. For the next 3 days, he didn't complain about the food. He didn't fight the physical therapy. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, constructing a complex mental map of potential benefactors. It had to be a rival. That was the only logical conclusion. Perhaps Musk? No, too flashy. Bezos? Too calculating. It had to be someone who wanted his intellectual property, someone who knew that Julian Vance's brain was worth preserving, even if his body was broken. They were keeping him on ice, waiting for him to wake up so they could extract his secrets. His arrogance, dormant for days, began to bloom again like a poisonous flower. He wasn't a charity case. He was an asset, a valuable asset. Nurse, Julian commanded on the 4th morning. His voice was stronger now, fueled by delusion. I wish to speak to the administrator. The nurse, a young woman named Sarah who usually ignored him, looked up from her tablet. The administrator is busy. Tell them, Julian said, lifting his chin, that I know about the arrangement. I know about the payments. And I am ready to negotiate terms. Sarah looked confused, but she typed something into her device. I'll pass the message along. Julian smoothed the sheets over his wasted legs. He would demand a percentage of the company. He would demand reinstatement. He would make them pay for the 8 years of silence. An hour later, the heavy door swung open. Julian straightened up, putting on his best boardroom face. So, Julian began. You finally decided to show your... The words died in his throat. It wasn't a suit-wearing executive. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Dr. Kale. She walked in slowly, closing the door behind her with a deliberate click. She was holding a tablet, her face obscured as always by the mask, her amber eyes cold and unamused. You asked for the administrator, she said flatly. I asked for the person paying my bills, Julian corrected, though his confidence wavered slightly. I asked for the benefactor, not the hired help. Dr. Kale walked to the foot of the bed. She placed the tablet on the rolling table and pushed it toward him. You think this is a negotiation, Julian? She asked. I know my worth, Julian said, trying to sound imperious. Someone has paid millions to keep me here. They obviously want something. I am prepared to offer my consulting services in exchange for a restoration of my lifestyle. Dr. Kale stared at him for a long moment. Then, a sound escaped her, a dry, sharp sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. Consulting services, she repeated. You think you're being kept alive because of your mind? She leaned forward, her hands gripping the footboard of the bed. You aren't an asset, Julian. You're a project. A pro bono experiment. Liar, Julian spat. Experiments don't get private rooms. Who is signing the checks? An anonymous donor, Dr. Kale said. Someone who has more money than sense. Someone who wanted to see if a man without a heart could actually be kept alive by machines. She tapped the tablet. Your benefactor doesn't want your consulting. They don't want your secrets. They want to watch you struggle. Why? Julian whispered. Dr. Kale's eyes narrowed. Maybe they want to see if suffering builds character. So far, the data is unpromising. She snatched the tablet back. Stop harassing the staff, Julian. Your angel isn't coming to save you. They're just paying for the cage. The next morning, Julian was wheeled down the hall for a specialized scan. The hospital was larger than he realized, a sprawling complex of glass and steel. As the orderly pushed him past the nurse's station, the wheelchair hit a bump, and Julian winced. Sorry, the orderly muttered. We're going into Dr. Kale's wing. The flooring transitions. Dr. Kale's wing? Julian thought. She's just a doctor. Why does she have a wing? They wheeled him into a large, corner office to wait for the MRI technicians. The room was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, the view Julian used to have. The furniture was sleek, modern, expensive, but it was the object on the desk that stopped Julian's heart. It sat on top of a stack of medical journals, acting as a paperweight. It was a fist-sized lump of metal, twisted, jagged, violent, and it was painted Rosso Corsa red. Julian stared at it. He knew that color. He knew that specific, agonizing shade of red. It was the color of his ambition, the color of his Ferrari. You're staring, a voice said. Dr. Kale emerged from a side door, drying her hands with a paper towel. She saw his gaze fixed on the desk. She walked over, picked up the jagged lump of metal, and weighed it in her hand. Do you know what this is? She asked. My car, Julian breathed. That's a piece of the Monza. It was pulled out of your chest cavity, Dr. Kale said calmly. 10 years ago. It missed your heart by 3 millimeters. The surgeons wanted to throw it away. She placed it back on the desk with a heavy thud. I kept it. Why? Julian asked, his eyes unable to leave the twisted metal. Is it a trophy? Did you save my life just to keep a souvenir? Dr. Kale sat on the edge of her desk, looking down at him. The sunlight hit the scar on her jaw, illuminating the harsh line of it. I keep it to remind me of what stupidity looks like, she said. That piece of metal cost $2.8 million, and it almost killed a man who had everything. She picked up a pen and tapped the red scrap. It's not a trophy, Julian. It's a monument to bad investments. You traded your life for this. And now, this is the only piece of your legacy that still exists. A paperweight on my desk. Give it to me, Julian demanded, his hand twitching. It's mine. Nothing is yours, Dr. Kale said, her voice dropping to a whisper. You don't own the gown you're wearing. You don't own the air in your lungs. And you certainly don't own this. She leaned in close. This red metal? It bought this wing. Or rather, the failure of the man who bought it motivated the person who built this wing. Little did he know, he wasn't just looking at a piece of a car. He was looking at the reason his daughter had become the most terrifying surgeon in the city. Every time she looked at that red scrap, she remembered the check he didn't write. And that memory sharpened her scalpel like a diamond. Desperation is a quiet architect. It builds elaborate plans in the silence of the night. Julian waited until the graveyard shift settled in. That heavy, sluggish hour between 3 a.m. and dawn when the hospital hummed with a low, mechanical rhythm. He had been watching the staff for days, profiling them with the same predatory instinct he used to use on junior executives. He zeroed in on Marcus, a young night nurse with fraying cuffs on his scrubs and dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a second job or a new baby. Marcus looked tired. Marcus looked like he needed money. When Marcus entered to check the vitals, Julian was ready. He sat up, ignoring the stiffness in his spine, and put on the most charming smile his withered face could muster. Marcus, Julian whispered, his voice smooth despite the rasp. You look exhausted, son. Marcus blinked, surprised that the patient in 409 was engaging in small talk. Just a long week, Mr. Vance. I remember long weeks, Julian said, nodding sagely. When I was building my first company, I didn't sleep for 3 years. But the payout was worth it. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. I can change your life, Marcus. Marcus stopped typing on the computer. He looked at Julian warily. Sir, I know what the records say. Julian hissed urgently. They say I'm broke. They say I'm indigent. But men like me, we always have a contingency. I have accounts in the Caymans that the lawyers couldn't find. Encrypted. Accessible only by my biometrics. He paused for effect. I need a phone, Marcus. A burner. Untraceable. Get me one, and the moment I access those funds, I will wire you $100,000. Marcus stared at him. For a moment, Julian thought he had him. He saw the calculation in the young man's eyes. 100,000, Julian repeated. Tax-free. Just for a cheap plastic phone. Marcus looked at the door, then back at Julian. He reached into his pocket. Julian's heart leaped. Yes, greed is universal. But instead of a phone, Marcus pulled out a small digital recorder. He tapped the screen. Did you get that, Dr. Kale? Marcus asked the device. A voice crackled from the speaker, crisp, awake, and amused. Loud and clear, Marcus. Thank you. Julian froze. His blood ran cold. You wiretapped me? Julian gasped. We monitor high-risk patients, Marcus said, his tired expression replaced by one of professional detachment. Especially the delusional ones who try to bribe federal employees with imaginary money. The door opened. Dr. Kale leaned against the frame. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She was in a sleek trench coat, clearly on her way out or just arriving. She looked at Julian with that same infuriating lack of anger. The Caymans' accounts were drained in 2016, Julian, she said softly. By the IRS. You don't have a contingency. You have a hallucination. She nodded to Marcus. Put it in his chart. Patient exhibits bargaining behavior consistent with stage 3 grief. As they walked out, Julian heard Marcus chuckle. It wasn't a malicious laugh, but it was worse. It was the laugh of someone dismissing a child's silly story. Julian sank back into his pillows, the humiliation burning hotter than the fever he felt rising in his cheeks. He thought money was a universal language, unaware that his currency had expired a long time ago. The failed bribe broke something in Julian. It wasn't his spirit, that was too calcified to break easily, but it shattered his patience. The silence of the room became unbearable. He needed to know why he was so alone. When Dr. Kale arrived for rounds the next afternoon, Julian didn't wait for her to check the monitors. Isabella, he said, the name landing heavy in the room. You said she was dead. How? Dr. Kale stopped writing. She looked at him over the top of her glasses. Are you sure you want to know? I have a right, Julian demanded. She was my wife. Did she take her own life? When the money ran out. It was a projection, of course. Julian couldn't imagine living without money. He assumed Isabella, fragile Isabella, would have crumbled instantly without his checkbook. No, Dr. Kale said, her voice turning icy. She didn't take the easy way out. She worked. Isabella never worked a day in her life, Julian scoffed. She worked 2 jobs, Kale corrected, stepping closer to the bed. After the crash, the assets were frozen during the investigation. To pay for your private nurses in the beginning, before the liquidation, she took a job as a night manager at a hotel. And during the day, she worked retail. Julian blinked. Isabella? The woman who couldn't pump her own gas? Working retail? She sold her jewelry. She sold her clothes. She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in the valley. Kale continued, her words rhythmic and sharp, like punches. She spent 18 hours a day on her feet to keep you in a private facility because she thought you might wake up. And? Julian asked, his voice trembling slightly. And her heart gave out. Kale said flatly. Stress-induced cardiomyopathy. She died on a bus, Julian, on her way to her second shift. 2 years after your accident. The room went silent. Julian stared at the blanket. He felt a pinch in his chest, a strange, foreign sensation. Guilt? No, it couldn't be guilt. It was regret. Regret that his asset manager had failed so spectacularly. She was foolish, Julian whispered. She should have liquidated the Ferrari immediately. She should have sued the city. She had terrible business instincts. Dr. Kale's knuckles turned white on the clipboard. She didn't do it for business, Kale said, her voice tight. She did it because she loved you. Though God knows why. Julian looked up, his eyes narrowing as he searched for a way to deflect the pain. He found the perfect scapegoat. It was the girl, he muttered. Sienna. If Isabella hadn't been so worried about that crippled child, she would have focused on the accounts. Sienna drained her focus. Sienna killed her. The air in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dr. Kale stood very still. The amber eyes behind the glasses didn't just look at him, they dissected him. You blame the 10-year-old girl, Kale whispered, for her mother dying while trying to keep you alive? Children are resource-intensive, Julian said, retreating into his cold logic. If Sienna had just been strong, none of this would have happened. Dr. Kale stared at him for a long, terrifying moment. Then, she slowly uncapped her pen. You're right about one thing, Julian, she said softly. Sienna is very resource-intensive, but you have no idea what she's capable of building with those resources. She made a note on his chart, her pen tearing through the paper. Little did Julian know, he had just signed the warrant for his own suffering. He shifted the blame like a heavy stone, placing it squarely on the shoulders of a ghost, never realizing the ghost was holding the pen. I want a second opinion. Julian crossed his arms over his chest, a gesture that would have been intimidating if he weren't wearing a gown with ducks on it. He glared at Dr. Kale. I do not accept your treatment plan, he announced. Physical therapy is torture. The diet is slop. And your bedside manner is grounds for malpractice. I demand to see the board of directors. I want a review of my case by a senior physician. Dr. Kale looked up from the tablet where she was adjusting his medication dosages. You want to speak to the management? I want to speak to your boss, Julian sneered. I know how hospitals work. There is always a hierarchy. You are clearly just a resident or a junior attending. Fetch the chief of neurology. Dr. Kale stared at him. A small, dry smile touched the corner of her lips beneath the mask. Okay, she said. I'll convene the board. They meet in 5 minutes. She walked out. Julian smiled smugly. Finally, he thought. Now we get somewhere. I will charm the chief. I will explain the situation. I will get better food. 10 minutes later, the door opened. 2 young men in short white coats walked in. They looked terrified. They held their clipboards like shields. They stood against the wall, eyes wide, barely breathing. Then, Dr. Kale walked in. She wasn't wearing the scrubs anymore. She was wearing a pristine, tailored white coat. Embroidered on the chest pocket, in bold navy thread, were the words, Dr. Sienna Kale, Chief of Neurosurgery. She walked to the center of the room. The 2 young doctors straightened up as if electrified. Gentlemen, Dr. Kale said, her voice commanding the room. The patient in 409 has requested a review of his case by the chief of neurology. Please present the case. One of the young men stepped forward, his voice shaking. Patient is a 55-year-old male, post-traumatic coma, 10-year duration. Current attending physician, Dr. Kale. Treatment plan, aggressive rehabilitation. And the prognosis? Kale asked, looking at Julian. Prognosis is entirely dependent on the chief's discretion, the young doctor stammered. Dr. Kale turned to Julian. She spread her hands. I have reviewed the case, she said, her voice dripping with irony. And I find that the current attending physician is a genius who is keeping a difficult, ungrateful patient alive against all odds. Julian stared at the embroidery on her coat. Chief, he gasped. You run the department? I run the wing, Julian, she said calmly. I built this wing. I hired these doctors. I wrote the protocols you were complaining about. She stepped closer, towering over his bed. There is no one to call. There is no manager above me. In this building, on this floor, I am the judge, the jury, and the executioner. She dismissed the terrified juniors with a wave of her hand. They scrambled out of the room, relieved to escape her orbit. So, she said, leaning down until her face was inches from his. Do you still want a second opinion? Or are you ready to eat your oatmeal? Julian slumped back against the pillows. He had asked to speak to the manager, not realizing he was sleeping in the manager's house. The hierarchy he loved so much had just crushed him. He was at the bottom, and the woman with the amber eyes was looking down from a height he couldn't even comprehend. Night fell differently in the hospital. It wasn't a gentle dimming of the light. It was an abandonment. The bustling noise of the day's shift evaporated, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against Julian's eardrums. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling tile directly above his head. It had a water stain shaped vaguely like the continent of Africa. He had memorized every crack, every fissure in the paint. This was his kingdom now, a 10 by 10 box of sterilized air. For the first time since waking up, the rage didn't come to keep him warm. The indignation that had fueled his demands for lawyers and managers had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in the center of his chest. He looked at his hands resting on the blanket. They were skeletal, the skin translucent and spotted with age. They were the hands of a grandfather, not a titan. "I am nothing," he whispered to the dark. The words hung in the air, uncontradicted. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the image of his old office, the mahogany desk, the view of the bay. But the image was fuzzy, like a photograph left out in the sun too long. Instead, his mind kept drifting back to the lullaby Dr. Kale had hummed. "Dormi, dormi, bel bambino." A sound from the hallway snapped his eyes open. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate clicks of hard heels on linoleum. They stopped just outside his door. Julian held his breath. "Yes, he's awake," a voice said softly. It was Dr. Kale. She was speaking on a phone, her tone unguarded in a way he hadn't heard before. "No, he hasn't changed. The arrogance is still there, calcified around his heart like plaque." A pause. Julian strained to hear the person on the other end, but there was only silence. "I know," Kale continued, her voice dropping to a murmur that sounded almost sad. "But we proceed as planned. The medical necessity is ending. The real surgery is about to begin." Real surgery? Julian's pulse spiked. What did that mean? Was there something wrong with him that they hadn't told him? Or was she planning something else? "Don't worry," Kale said. "He won't recognize me. He looks right through me. To him, I'm just part of the furniture. I'm just the help." She laughed, a dry sound. "I'll see you tomorrow. Good night." The footsteps clicked away, fading down the corridor. Julian lay frozen. She was talking about him. "He won't recognize me." The phrase looped in his mind. Who did she think she was? Did they meet at a gala once? Did he fire her father? He tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of an obsessed employee, but a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He wasn't just a patient to Dr. Kale. He was a target. And whatever she was planning, it wasn't a medical procedure. It was a reckoning. The morning light was gray and unforgiving. It highlighted the dust on the windowsill and the deep lines etched into Julian's face. When Dr. Kale entered, she didn't bring a stethoscope. She brought a file folder thick enough to be a novel. She threw it onto his bedside table. It landed with a heavy thud that made the water in his cup tremble. "Good morning, Julian," she said, pulling a chair over and sitting down, something she had never done before. "We need to discuss your discharge." Julian sat up straighter, a spark of hope igniting. "Discharge? You're releasing me. Medically, you are stable," Kale said, crossing her legs. "You still require extensive physical therapy, but you no longer need acute neurological monitoring. The hospital board," she tapped her chest ironically, "has determined that you are occupying a bed needed for patients who actually have insurance." "Fine," Julian said, trying to summon his old bluster. "I want to leave. This place is a prison. Call a car service. Have them take me to a hotel." "A hotel requires a credit card," Kale noted dryly. "And as we established, your credit rating is lower than your white blood cell count." "I will figure it out," Julian snapped. "Just get me out of here." "There is a protocol for indigent patients," Kale continued, ignoring him. "We arrange transport to a state-run shelter. There is one downtown. It's crowded, it smells like bleach and desperation, and the theft rate is high. But they have a bed." Julian recoiled as if she had slapped him. "A shelter? I am Julian Vance. I do not sleep in shelters." "Then pay your bill," Kale said softly. She opened the thick folder and pointed to the bottom line of the summary page. The number was bold, black, and horrifying. Total outstanding balance, $4,215,000. $4 million, Julian breathed. "That's the discount rate," Kale said. 10 years of private room care. Surgeries. Medications. 24-hour nursing. Someone was paying it for a long time, Julian. But the well has run dry. And now, the bill is due. She leaned forward. "So, here is the ultimatum. You can go to the shelter today. I have the paperwork right here. Or, you can sign a promissory note acknowledging this debt, and I will personally authorize a grace period. You stay here, in the charity wing, until you are physically strong enough to work." "Work?" Julian laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "I am 55 years old. I can't walk. What work?" "We'll find something," Kale said, her eyes glinting. But first, you have to acknowledge the debt. You have to admit that you cannot pay for your own survival. She held out a pen. Julian looked at the paper. It was a confession of failure, a surrender. But the thought of a shelter, of sleeping next to junkies and failures, was impossible. His vanity was the only thing he had left intact. With a shaking hand, he took the pen. He signed his name, Julian Vance. The signature was jagged, weak. Wise choice, Cale said, snatching the paper back. Now you don't belong to the state. You belong to the hospital. You belong to me. The signature gnawed at him. He had signed away his freedom to a doctor with a God complex. But Julian Vance was a deal-maker. He just needed leverage. He needed capital. I need to make calls, he told Dr. Cale later that afternoon. If I am to pay this ridiculous debt, I need to activate my network. I have contacts, investors, men who owe me favors. Cale looked at him with an expression of mild curiosity, like a scientist watching a rat run a maze it doesn't know is closed. You really believe that, she said. I built an empire, Julian insisted. Empires leave footprints. Give me a phone. To his surprise, she didn't argue. She reached into her white coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. She unlocked it and handed it to him. Be my guest, she said. The Wi-Fi is fast. Julian grabbed the phone like a lifeline. He pulled up the browser. His fingers, clumsy and stiff, tapped out the names of his old partners. Sterling, Blackwood, Harrison. He found the number for Sterling's new venture capital firm. He dialed. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sterling Partners, how may I direct your call? A receptionist asked. Connect me to Xavier Sterling, Julian commanded, his voice gaining strength. Tell him it's Julian Vance. Tell him I'm back. There was a pause. Then, a confused silence. I'm sorry, sir. Who? Julian Vance. His partner. Just put him on. One moment. Music played. Vivaldi. It sounded like the music he used to play in his own lobby. He waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. Then a man's voice came on the line. Not Sterling. This is Mr. Sterling's executive assistant. Who is this? This is Julian Vance. Julian barked. Stop the screening games. Put Xavier on. Sir. The voice was cold. Xavier Sterling gave strict instructions regarding your name 10 years ago. If you ever called, we were to tell you that the statute of limitations on friendship expired the day you bought that car. Do not call here again. Click. Julian stared at the phone. He dialed again. Harrison, his old golf partner. Hello. Harrison, it's Julian. Julian? Julian Vance. My God, I thought you were dead. I'm alive. Harrison, I'm in a jam. I need a bridge loan. Just a few million to get liquid. I have ideas, Harrison. Big ideas. A sigh on the other end. Julian, listen. You know what they say about you, right? You're the cautionary tale. The man who crashed a Ferrari and lost everything. I can't be associated with that toxicity. The board would eat me alive. Good luck, Julian. Click. He called Reynolds, the car dealer. Disconnected. He called his old club. Membership revoked in 2015 for non-payment. He called 5 more numbers. 3 didn't answer. 1 laughed. 1 threatened to call the police for harassment. Julian lowered the phone slowly. The silence in the room was absolute. He wasn't just broke. He was erased. The network he thought was made of steel was actually made of smoke, and it had blown away a decade ago. Dr. Cale was leaning against the windowsill, watching him. She hadn't moved the entire time. Done? She asked softly. Julian dropped the phone onto the bedsheet. He felt cold, colder than he had ever felt in the snow. They moved on, he whispered. No, Julian, Cale said, walking over and retrieving the phone. They didn't move on. You pushed them away. You built a life on transactions, not relationships. And when you had nothing left to trade, the market closed. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. You're a ghost, Julian. And ghosts don't get bridge loans. She walked out, leaving him alone with the crushing realization that he had survived the crash only to find out that his life hadn't. The rejection from his former life sat heavy in the room, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. Julian Vance lay in the semi-darkness, the phone, a black brick of useless plastic, resting on the bedside table where Dr. Cale had left it. She had called him a ghost. The worst part wasn't the insult, it was the accuracy. To distract himself from the crushing silence of his dead network, Julian focused his eyes on the room itself. He had spent days looking through things, staring past the walls to a future that didn't exist. Now he looked at them. He studied the peeling paint near the vent. He studied the rhythmic drip of the saline bag. He studied the white, dry erase board mounted on the wall opposite his bed. It was standard hospital decor. A grid for today's date, nurse on duty, and plan of care. He had ignored it for weeks, dismissing it as administrative clutter. But now, with nothing else to read and no one left to call, the words sharpened in his vision. Date, October 24th, 2024. Nurse, Marcus. Attending physician, Dr. Sienna Kale. Julian blinked. The name Kale scratched at the back of his mind, an itch he couldn't quite reach. It was a unique name, sharp and guttural. It wasn't common like Smith or Jones. He rolled the sound of it around in his head. Kale. He closed his eyes, diving into the deep archives of his memory, past the Ferrari, past the IPOs, past the boardrooms. He went back to the beginning, to a small chapel in Napa Valley, 30 years ago. He was standing at the altar, watching Isabella walk toward him. She was radiant, terrifyingly beautiful, and carrying a bouquet of white roses. The priest's voice echoed in the cavern of his memory. Do you, Julian Vance, take Isabella Kale to be your wedded wife? Julian's eyes snapped open. The air left his lungs in a rush. Isabella Kale. She had kept her maiden name professionally for years before finally succumbing to his demand that she become a Vance. Kale was her father's name. It was the name on the birth certificate of the daughter he had deemed a bad investment. He looked at the board again. Dr. Sienna Kale. The first name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Sienna. The name of the earth. The name of the girl who had cried in the penthouse. The pieces slammed together. The amber eyes. The lullaby. The cold fury. The twisted metal of the Ferrari on her desk. The resource-intensive child who had somehow grown into the woman holding his life in her hands. His hands began to shake, rattling the bed rails. It wasn't possible. The girl was a cripple. She needed spinal fusion. She was weak. He had left her to nature's course. How could that broken thing be the chief of neurosurgery? But the name was there, written in blue marker, mocking him. Dr. Sienna Kale. He wasn't just a patient. He was a prisoner in a jail built by his own blood. The door opened. It was the sound Julian had been dreading and craving in equal measure. Dr. Kale walked in for her evening rounds. She moved with that same infuriating precision, her heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. She picked up his chart, her back to him, ignoring him as she always did. She was just a mechanic checking an engine. But today, Julian didn't see a doctor. He saw a ghost. Turn around, Julian croaked. She didn't move. I'm reviewing your vitals, Julian. Quiet. Turn around, he shouted, the effort tearing at his throat. Look at me. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the chart. She turned. For the first time, she wasn't wearing the surgical mask. It hung loosely around her neck, revealing the rest of her face. He stared. He searched for the 10-year-old girl in the severe lines of the woman before him. He looked for the softness, the fear, the neediness. He found none of it. Her jaw was set in granite. Her mouth was a thin, hard line. But the eyes were Isabella's. And the shape of her nose, the curve of her brow, it was undeniably his own reflection staring back at him, stripped of all weakness. Sienna, he whispered. The name felt foreign in his mouth, a word he hadn't spoken in a decade. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. Her expression didn't soften into a reunion smile. If anything, her face grew colder, like a lake freezing over. Dr. Kale, she corrected him. Her voice was a razor blade wrapped in silk. It's you, Julian breathed, struggling to push himself up. You're her. My daughter. Biologically, perhaps, she said, stepping closer to the bed. But biology is just chemistry, Julian. It's not a relationship. And it's certainly not a credit line. I thought you were. He couldn't finish the sentence. You thought I was crippled, she finished for him. You thought I was a bad investment? You thought nature would take its course. She leaned over the bed rails, her presence overwhelming him. Nature is cruel, Julian. But I found that surgery is crueler. I survived. Mom worked 3 jobs to pay for the brace, for the therapy, for the tuition. She died so I could stand. And I stood so I could become the person who decides if you get to stand. She tapped her chest, right over the embroidery that read Chief. You looked for a benefactor. You looked for an angel. You found me. The girl you wouldn't spend $250,000 on has spent $4 million keeping you alive. Why? Julian asked, tears of confusion and shame pricking his eyes. If you hate me, why? Because death is easy, she whispered. And you owe me a debt that death can't pay. The shock of recognition faded quickly, replaced by the familiar surge of entitlement. Julian Vance wasn't a man who stayed on the defensive for long. He was a father. She was his child. That dynamic was ancient, immutable. It transcended money. He puffed out his chest, trying to loom large in the bed. He summoned the voice he used to use when she was 5 and refused to eat her vegetables. So, Julian said, his tone shifting from shock to authority. You are a doctor. A chief. That is acceptable. You have done well for yourself, considering the disadvantages. Sienna stared at him, one eyebrow arching slightly. She looked almost amused. Disadvantages? She repeated. I made you, Julian declared. He pointed a shaking finger at her. I provided the genetics. I provided the lifestyle for the first 10 years that gave you the foundation to succeed. You are intelligent because I am intelligent. You are driven because I am driven. He took a breath, his confidence returning like a drug. And now that we have established this misunderstanding, things will change. I am your father, Sienna. You cannot keep me in this indigent ward. You cannot feed me slop. You have the means. I expect to be transferred to the VIP suite immediately. I expect respect. He waited for her to crumble. He waited for the little girl who desperately wanted Daddy's approval to surface. Instead, Sienna laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was dry, sharp, and terrifying. It sounded like a gavel banging in an empty courtroom. You expect? She asked, walking to the foot of the bed. You think you command me? I am your father. Julian roared. I gave you life. You gave a sperm donation, she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. And then you tried to buy a car with the money meant to save that life. She gripped the bed rail, her knuckles white. You didn't make me, Julian. You bought a Ferrari. I made myself. I forged myself in the fire of your neglect. Every A I got in medical school, every surgery I performed, every promotion I earned was fueled by the absolute necessity of proving that I was worth more than a limited edition bumper. She leaned in, her face inches from his. You are not the patriarch here. You are not the boss. You are a 55-year-old man with no assets, no home, and a failing body who is alive solely because I allow it. You don't give orders in my hospital. You take them. She straightened up, smoothing her white coat. And if you ever raise your voice to me again, she said softly, I will discharge you to the shelter tonight. And I will make sure they give you the bunk by the bathroom. Do you understand me, patient 409? Julian opened his mouth to argue, to scream, to assert his dominance. But he looked into her amber eyes, his eyes, and saw something he had never seen in a mirror. He saw consequences. He closed his mouth. He looked away. Good, Sienna said. Now, eat your oatmeal. It's good for your bones. And you're going to need strong bones for what comes next. The following afternoon, the lessons in humility continued, but this time, the classroom was financial. Sienna didn't come alone. She brought a man in a gray suit, not a doctor, but an accountant. He looked like a funeral director, solemn and quiet. They set up a laptop on the rolling table at the foot of Julian's bed. You mentioned earlier that you wanted to understand the financial logistics, Sienna said, tapping the keyboard. Since you signed the acknowledgement of debt, I think it's time you saw the full portfolio. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. It was complex, a web of shell companies, trusts, and acquisitions. Julian squinted at it, his business brain instinctively trying to decode the flow of capital. This is the hospital's operating budget, Julian muttered. Why are you showing me this? Look closer at line item 409, Sienna said. Julian traced the line. Vance Care Subsidization Trust. It's a holding company, Julian said, confused. Who owns it? I do, Sienna said. I established it 8 years ago, shortly after I completed my residency and developed the Kale procedure. It's a specialized patent for spinal reconstruction. It's very lucrative. She walked around the bed, her heels sinking silently into the cheap linoleum. When the state threatened to move you to a long-term care facility, a warehouse for the dying, I intervened. I bought your debt, Julian. Every cent of it. The hospital didn't want you. You were a liability. So I securitized you. Julian felt a wave of nausea. You securitized me? I bought the debt at pennies on the dollar. The accountant chimed in, his voice dry. Dr. Kale then used the loss carry-forward to offset the tax burden of her patent income. Sienna nodded. You see, Julian, you aren't just a patient. You are a tax shelter. I keep you alive, in this room, with these monitors, and in exchange, the IRS allows me to write off millions in charitable losses. You are literally worth more to me as a deduction than you ever were as a father. Julian stared at her. It was brilliant. It was cold. It was exactly something he would have done, and that terrified him. You kept me as a pet, he whispered. A tax write-off. I kept you as an asset, she corrected, closing the laptop. You always said family was a bad investment. I just proved you wrong. You've saved me a fortune in taxes. She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper. But the tax year is ending, Julian. And I'm rethinking my portfolio strategy. Maybe it's time to liquidate. Little did he know, his body was listening to the threat of liquidation, and it was preparing to crash just as hard as his portfolio had. The crash happened at 3 a.m. It started as a twitch in his left hand, a rhythmic spasm that he couldn't control. Then it spread. Fire raced up his arm, exploding in the base of his skull. The room tilted violently to the left. The hum of the machines turned into a roar, like a jet engine taking off inside his head. Julian tried to call out, to scream for Marcus, but his jaw locked. His back arched off the mattress, agonizingly stiff. The monitors screamed, a high-pitched wail that sliced through the quiet of the ward. Seizure, his mind registered through the panic. Massive seizure. Nurses rushed in. Hands held him down. A syringe was jammed into his fore. But the darkness was closing in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. When he woke up, the light was harsh and unforgiving. He was in a different room, recovery. The air tasted of metal. Dr. Kale stood over him. She wasn't wearing her white coat. She was in surgical greens, a mask hanging around her neck. She looked tired. She looked grim. "Welcome back," she said, her voice lacking its usual bite. "That was a close one." "What happened?" Julian wheezed. "Post-traumatic syringomyelia," Sienna said, using the medical term like a weapon. "A cyst has formed on your spinal cord, right at the site of the original fracture from the crash. It ruptured last night. It's compressing the brainstem." She pulled up a digital scan on the monitor next to his head. It showed a ghostly gray image of his spine, a dark blob pressed against the delicate white line of the cord. "It's fatal if untreated," she said simply. "It will cause paralysis, then respiratory failure, then death. Probably within 48 hours. Julian stared at the scan. It looked terrifyingly familiar. It looked exactly like the X-ray of a 10-year-old girl's spine he had seen in his penthouse office a decade ago. "You need surgery," Sienna said. "A decompression and fusion. It's complex. Risky. Expensive." "Do it," Julian gasped. "I don't want to die." Sienna didn't move. She didn't call the team. She just stood there, crossing her arms. "It's not that simple, Julian. There is only one surgeon in the state qualified to perform this specific procedure on a patient with your level of atrophy." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it snapped. "Me." The irony hit Julian like a sledgehammer. The man who refused to pay for a spinal surgery to buy a car now needed a spinal surgery from the daughter he abandoned. The universe wasn't just cruel, it was poetic. "Please," Julian whispered. "I haven't decided if I'm taking the case," Sienna said calmly. "I have a full schedule. Paying patients. People who didn't abandon their children. Why should I bump them for you?" An hour later, Sienna returned with a clipboard. She didn't hand it to him. She held it, reading the fine print aloud, as if she were reading a bedtime story to a child she didn't like. "Consent for high-risk neurosurgery," she read. "Risks include infection, hemorrhage, permanent paralysis, stroke, and death. Success rate is approximately 60%. She lowered the clipboard and looked at him. 60%, she repeated. "Does that number ring a bell, Julian?" "It should. It's the exact statistic you quoted to my mother when you told her I wasn't worth the investment." Julian closed his eyes. He remembered. "The success rate is 60%. I won't liquidate capital for a gamble." "I was wrong," Julian croaked. I was a fool." "You were a businessman," Sienna corrected. "You made a risk assessment. Now, I have to make mine." She walked to the window, looking out at the brick wall. "You have no money. You have no insurance. You are a drain on the hospital's resources. If I operate, It will cost the department roughly $200,000 in time and materials. If I don't operate, nature takes its course. She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. That was your philosophy, wasn't it? If she is weak, that is nature taking its course. Why should I interfere with nature now, Julian? You are weak. Your body is failing. Isn't this just the legacy you chose? Sienna, please, Julian begged, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. I am your father. You lost that title in the showroom, she said. To me, you are a decision, a calculation. She walked back to the bed and held out the pen. But unlike you, I swore an oath. First, do no harm. She placed the clipboard on his chest. It felt heavy, like a tombstone. Sign the consent form, Julian. Admit that you are weak. Admit that you need saving. And admit that the only person in the world who can save you is the bad investment you try to throw away. Julian's hand shook violently as he reached for the pen. He looked at the signature line. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. Signing the check for the Ferrari had been easy, a stroke of ego. Signing this was an act of total submission. He signed. Julian Vance. Sienna took the clipboard. She checked the signature, her face impassive. Prep him 4 or 1, she said to the nurse waiting outside. And tell the anesthesiologist to go light on the sedation. I want him to hear the saw. She looked back at Julian one last time. See you on the table, Dad. The gurney wheels squeaked, a rhythmic, high-pitched protest that sounded like a mouse trapped in a trap. Julian stared up at the fluorescent lights flashing by overhead, counting them to keep from screaming. 1, 2, 3. Each light was a second closer to the knife. He wasn't ready. The bravado he had worn like armor for 55 years had disintegrated the moment he signed that paper. Now, stripped of his suit, his money, and his dignity, he was just biological matter waiting to be cut. They rolled him into the pre-op holding area, a freezing cold room lined with curtains. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes that annoyed him, adjusted his blanket. Dr. Kale will be in shortly to mark the site, she said gently. Julian shivered. It wasn't the cold. It was the terror. A moment later, the curtain whipped back. Sienna stood there. She looked like an executioner in teal scrubs. She held a thick black marker in her hand. Sit up, she commanded. Julian struggled to obey, his arms shaking. She pulled down the back of his gown, exposing the wasted skin of his spine. He felt the cold tip of the marker trace a line down his vertebrae. It felt like she was carving her name into him. You're trembling, she noted, capping the marker with a sharp click. It's cold, Julian lied. It's fear, she corrected. She walked around to face him. And it should be. You know the stats. You know my skill level. But you also know that I have every reason to let my hand slip. Just a millimeter, Julian. Just a tiny tremor, and you never walk again. Or you never wake up. You took an oath, Julian whispered, his voice sounding small in the sterile room. Oaths are words, Sienna said, leaning in close. Like vows. In sickness and in health. You broke yours. Why should I keep mine? She stared into his eyes, searching for something. I need to hear you say it, she said softly. Say what? The truth. No business jargon. No ROI. No legacy. I want to hear you admit what you are. Julian swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was filled with glass. He looked at this powerful woman, this titan he had created by abandoning her, and he realized he had no leverage left. I am afraid, he croaked. Deeper, she ordered. I am alone. Deeper. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking out to mix with the antiseptic smell of the room. I am weak, he whispered. I am weak, Sienna. Please, save me. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. 2, 3. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't gentle, but it was steady. See, Sienna said, her voice devoid of warmth but filled with power. That wasn't so hard. Nature rewards the strong, Julian. But mercy? Mercy is something you have to beg for. She turned to the nurse. Take him in. The operating room was a spaceship. That was the only way Julian's drug-addled mind could process it. It was gleaming chrome, terrifying machines, and lights so bright they felt like the sun exploding. They shifted him onto the narrow table. His arms were strapped down. His head was clamped into a halo device to keep his neck rigid. He was crucified on the altar of modern medicine. Sienna entered the room with her hands held up, dripping with water. A nurse dried them with reverence. Sienna snapped on gloves, the latex popping like gunshots. She stepped up to the table, towering over him. "Anesthesia," she commanded. "Pushing propofol," a voice said from behind Julian's head. The room began to swim. The edges of his vision blurred. But Julian fought the sleep. He needed to see her face one last time. He needed to know if she was going to save him or end him. Sienna looked down. Her eyes were the only thing visible above the mask. They were cold, professional, and utterly terrifying. She held a scalpel in her right hand. The light caught the blade, turning it into a diamond splinter. "Do you know what this surgery is called, Julian?" she asked, her voice echoing in his fading consciousness. "No," he mumbled, his tongue heavy. "It's a reconstruction," she said. "We break the bones that grew wrong so we can set them right. We have to break you to fix you." She lowered the blade. "Count backward from 10. 10, Julian whispered. 9, 8. He saw the blade touch his skin. He saw her eyes narrow in concentration. He felt the pressure. 7. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. Then the darkness took him, deep and absolute, swallowing him whole. And in that black void, Julian Vance finally understood that money could buy a bed, but it couldn't buy the hand that held the knife. Pain was the first sign of life. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing pain of the crash. It was a deep, dull ache, heavy and structural, like his entire body had been taken apart and reassembled by a mechanic who tightened the bolts too much. Julian opened his eyes. The recovery room was dim. The beep of the monitor was slow and steady. Beep, beep, beep. He was alive. He took a breath, expecting the rattle of fluid, but his lungs filled clearly. He wiggled his toes. They moved. He felt the sheet against his feet. Sensation. Movement. Life. He let out a sob of relief. She hadn't killed him. She hadn't paralyzed him. She had saved him. "Stop crying," a voice said from the shadows. "It spikes your blood pressure." Sienna stepped into the light. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her white coat was wrinkled. She had been working on him for hours. You did it," Julian rasped, his throat raw from the breathing tube. "Thank you, Sienna, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, pulling a chair over. She didn't sit. She used it to prop up a thick leather portfolio she was carrying. "The surgery was a success," she said clinically. "I removed the cyst. I decompressed the nerve root. I fused C3 and C for using a titanium cage. You will have 90% mobility. You will walk. You will live." She tapped the leather portfolio. "But services rendered must be paid for." "I signed the debt," Julian said weakly. "I told you I'll work. I'll do anything. I'll consult. I don't want your consulting," she interrupted. "And I don't want your money, mostly because you don't have any." She opened the portfolio and pulled out a document. It was thick, bound in blue paper. "A legal contract. This is a settlement agreement," she said. "Between the hospital, the Vance Care Trust, and Julian Vance." She clicked a pen and held it out. "I am forgiving the debt. All $4.2 million. Plus the cost of today's surgery, which retails at $300,000. Julian's heart leaped. "You are forgiving it? Sienna, I knew you cared. I knew family meant something to you." "Read the terms," she said, her voice turning to ice. Julian squinted at the paper. His eyes widened as he scanned the clauses. Clause 1. The patient agrees to a permanent non-disclosure agreement regarding his relationship to Dr. Sienna Kale. Clause 2. The patient agrees to immediately vacate the city of San Francisco and not return within a 100-mile radius. Clause 3. The patient agrees to legally change his surname. "You want me to leave?" Julian whispered. "You want me to change my name?" "I bought your life, Julian," she said. "Now I'm selling it back to you. The price is your absence. I don't want you in my city. I don't want you in my hospital. And I certainly don't want you sharing my last name." She shoved the pen into his hand. "Sign it, or the debt stands, and I send the bill to collections tomorrow. You'll be in debtor's prison for the rest of your miserable life." The pen felt heavier than the scalpel must have felt in her hand. Julian looked at the document. It was an erasure. She wasn't just kicking him out. She was deleting him. If he signed this, Julian Vance, the billionaire, the titan, the father, ceased to exist. He would just be an old man named, whatever name he chose. "Smith? Doe? You can't do this," he pleaded, looking up at her. "I have nowhere to go. San Francisco is my home." "San Francisco is a city of innovators," Sienna said coldly. "You haven't innovated in 10 years. You're obsolete here." "But I'm your father," He tried one last time, playing the only card he had, the card he had burned 10 years ago. You were a donor, she corrected again. And donors remain anonymous. She checked her watch, a sleek, expensive timepiece that probably cost more than his first car. You have 5 minutes before the sedation wears off fully and the pain really hits. I suggest you sign while your hand is steady. Julian looked at the paper. Permanent exile. He thought about the shelter she had threatened him with. He thought about the cold, hard streets. If he signed, he was free of debt. He would have a clean slate. A terrifyingly empty, clean slate. He realized then that he had no choice. He never had a choice. From the moment he woke up in this bed, he had been a pawn in her game of 4D chess. With a trembling hand, he pressed the pen to the paper. He signed. Julian Vance. For the last time. Sienna snatched the paper away the moment the ink left the page. She checked the signature, nodded, and slid it into her portfolio. Good business decision, she said. I'll have the discharge papers processed. You leave in the morning. She turned to walk away. Sienna, he called out. She stopped, her hand on the door handle. She didn't turn around. Do you hate me that much? She stood there for a long moment, the silence of the recovery room humming between them. Hate requires energy, Julian, she said softly. I don't hate you. I just wanted a return on my investment. And now I have it. Closure. She walked out, leaving him alone with his new freedom, which felt suspiciously like exile. The next morning, the exit interview was brief. There was no fanfare, no team of doctors wishing him well. Just a nurse he didn't recognize handing him a plastic bag marked patient belongings. Julian sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in a pair of gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt that the hospital social worker had provided. They were cheap, scratchy, and smelled of industrial detergent. He put on his shoes, the same leather loafers he had worn into the Ferrari dealership 10 years ago. The leather was cracked, the soles stiff. They were relics of a dead man. He looked inside the plastic bag. His wallet. Empty, save for an expired driver's license. A watch that had stopped ticking in 2014. And a bus token. That was it. That was the sum total of 55 years of life on Earth. Dr. Kale entered the room. She wasn't wearing her white coat. She was dressed in a sharp navy business suit, ready for a board meeting. She looked powerful. She looked unstoppable. Ready? She asked. I suppose, Julian said, standing up. His legs were shaky, but they held. The titanium in his neck felt stiff, a permanent reminder of her handiwork. The social worker has arranged a placement for you in a halfway house in Sacramento, she said, handing him a slip of paper with an address. It's outside the 100-mile radius. There's a job program attached. Data entry. Minimum wage. It's honest work. Data entry. Julian repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I used to own the data centers. Used to, she reminded him. Adapt or die, Julian. She gestured to the door. Shall we? I have a surgery at 9. They walked down the hallway together. It was a surreal procession. The tall, powerful woman in the suit and the withered, shuffling man in the sweatpants. Nurses watched them pass. Some whispered. They knew. Everyone knew. They reached the elevator. Julian pressed the button for the lobby. He turned to her. Sienna, he said, his voice quiet. I know I failed you. I know I was a monster. But that day in the showroom, I did think about it. For a second, I hesitated. It was a lie. A small mercy he tried to give himself. Sienna looked at him. Her amber eyes were clear, unclouded by tears or sentiment. Hesitation is fatal in surgery, Julian, she said. And in parenting. You didn't just hesitate. You hung up the phone. The elevator doors opened. Sentiment is a liability, she said, quoting the philosophy he had lived by. You taught me that. It's the only lesson you ever gave me that stuck. She didn't step into the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby and stepped back. Goodbye, Julian. The doors slid shut, cutting off his view of her face. He was alone in the metal box, descending rapidly toward the ground floor, toward the street, toward nothing. The automatic doors of the hospital entrance slid open, and the world assaulted him. The noise was the first shock. Traffic, sirens, shouting, the hum of the city. After 10 years in a soundproof bubble, it sounded like a war zone. Then the smell. Exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, stale coffee, humanity. It made his head spin. And the light. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the glass towers of the financial district across the street. Towers where he used to have an office. Towers where men in suits were making millions right now, while he stood on the curb in sweatpants holding a plastic bag. He took a step forward, his legs trembling. He felt exposed. Naked. He was a creature of the indoors, of climate control and filtered air. Now he was just another piece of debris on the sidewalk. Passers-by ignored him. To them, he was just another old man discharged from the charity ward. No one saw the billionaire. No one saw the genius. They saw a failure. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. Sacramento. The bus station was 6 blocks away. He would have to walk. 6 blocks felt like a marathon. He started to move, shuffling along the curb. A cold wind whipped around the corner, cutting through his thin t-shirt. He shivered. He thought of the heated seats of the Ferrari. He thought of the cashmere coats he used to own. He reached the corner and stopped to catch his breath. A car pulled up to the curb next to him. A low, guttural purr of an engine that vibrated in his chest. He looked down. It was low. It was sleek. It was aggressive. It was a Ferrari. But it wasn't red. It was a deep, metallic blue, the color of the ocean at its coldest point. It was a Ferrari Monza SP2. The newer model. The better model. The window rolled down with a silent, expensive hum. Julian stared. The driver was wearing oversized sunglasses and a navy scarf. She looked like a movie star. She looked like royalty. It was Sienna. She sat in the driver's seat with the casual ease of someone who owns the road. Her hands rested lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. The interior was cream leather, pristine and smelling of success. Julian's mouth fell open. You bought one. Sienna lowered her sunglasses, looking at him over the rim. I bought 2, she said casually. One for the garage, one for the track. It turns out, when you don't waste money on bad investments, compound interest is quite powerful. She revved the engine. The sound was a roar, a lion asserting dominance. It was the sound Julian had traded his soul for. And now, his daughter was controlling it. Why are you here? Julian asked, a spark of hope flaring in his chest. Did you come to give me a ride? To the bus station? He took a step toward the car, his hand reaching for the door handle. Maybe she forgives me, he thought. Maybe this is the reconciliation. Maybe she'll drive me to Sacramento in style. Sienna watched his hand reach out. She didn't unlock the door. I didn't come to give you a ride, Julian, she said, her voice carrying over the engine's idle. I came to show you the upgrade. She tapped the steering wheel. You bought the SP1, the single-seater, the selfish car. You wanted to be alone. She gestured to the empty passenger seat beside her. This is the SP2. It has 2 seats. It's designed to be shared. Julian looked at the empty seat. It was inviting. It was salvation. Then let me in, he begged. Share it. Share it with your father. Sienna shook her head slowly. This seat isn't for you, Julian. It's for someone who stayed. It's for someone who answered the phone. She reached into the center console. Julian held his breath. Was she getting cash? A check? She pulled out a small, round metal object. She tossed it out the window. It clattered onto the pavement at Julian's feet. It was a second bus token. Just in case you lose the first one, she said. Redundancy is key in business. Julian stared at the token on the dirty concrete. It glinted in the sunlight, a tiny, mocking circle of copper. Sienna, he whispered, looking up at her. Don't leave me here. You left yourself here 10 years ago, she said. I'm just balancing the ledger. She put the car in gear. Invest that token wisely, Julian. It's the last capital you'll ever get from me. Wait, he screamed. I love you. I love you, Sienna. She paused. For a second, the engine quieted. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the 10-year-old girl. But it wasn't fear. It was relief. I know, she said softly. But you love yourself more. And that's a conflict of interest I can't accept. She punched the accelerator. The blue Ferrari launched forward, tires biting the asphalt. It didn't spin. It didn't crash. It surged down the avenue with perfect precision, weaving through traffic like a needle through silk. Julian watched it go. He watched the blue blur disappear into the canyon of steel and glass. He watched his legacy, his blood, and his dream drive away from him. He stood alone on the corner. The wind blew a discarded newspaper against his leg. People walked around him, annoyed by the old man blocking the sidewalk. Slowly, painfully, Julian bent down. His fused neck made it difficult, but he managed. He picked up the bus token. He wiped the dirt off it with his thumb. He held it tight in his fist, feeling the cold metal bite into his palm. It wasn't a steering wheel. It wasn't a fortune. It was a ride to nowhere. He turned and began the long, slow walk to the bus station, step by agonizing step, while the city he used to own towered above him, indifferent and unreachable. And that, my beautiful family, is the story of Julian Vance. A man who learned too late that the most expensive things in life aren't built in factories. They are born in our homes. He traded a diamond for a stone, and in the end, he was left with empty pockets and a heavy heart. Please, if you take nothing else from this story, remember this. Never sacrifice people for things. Things rust. Things break. Things can be replaced. But the people who love us, once they are gone, no amount of money can buy them back. Before you go, I have one favor to ask. The world is full of people like Julian who think kindness is weakness. Let's prove them wrong. If you believe in the power of family, if you believe in redemption, and if you want to help me show my mother that this community is real and powerful, please subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it tells me that you are listening, that you care, and that we are building something beautiful together. Until next time, hold your loved ones close. Stay blessed.